Welcome to Books in the Biz, the show where real-world business meets real-world results. Hosted by business strategist Dan Paulson and veteran CFO Richard Veltri, this podcast breaks down the stories, trends, and financial insights shaping today's companies. Dan brings decades of experience helping leaders simplify operations, build strong cultures, and scale with confidence. Rich adds his deep financial expertise from guiding organizations across healthcare, construction, logistics, and professional services. Together, they dig into what's really happening behind the numbers and what it means for owners, executives, and anyone trying to grow a stronger, smarter business. This is practical conversation, real talk, and tools you can use right now. Welcome to Books in the Biz.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Books in the Biz. Rich, how are you doing?
I'm good, sir. How are you?
I'm good. Looks like you survived last week without me.
Barely.
Well, I completely messed up my week last week, so thank you for covering for everything. That's kind of interesting. I was actually dealing with a client situation, and it's kind of related to this topic in a very broad sense, but I'm in a situation with this family-run business where one of the brothers has now taken over and looking to, try to get everything off his plate and kind of get the right leadership team in place. And that's kind of what we've been working on, which is where I link it to this, what we're talking about today is really, our company is prepared for kind of that next phase of growth or succession. And I think you and I would both agree that for what we see in the marketplace, a vast majority of companies, even though they're kind of in that phase of early thinking about it, really haven't prepared their business for what's next when they want to either step back or sell or do whatever with the business. And I thought it would be a good discussion. We've talked about it in the past, but I thought it'd be worth bringing up again of, what do you need to do when it comes to actually getting your company ready for when you want to no longer run it anymore?
How far back do you want to go? I
think we both have some examples. There's companies we've talked with that for whatever reason chose, for example, the M&A route. We have other companies that chose the, sell it outright. I think we're both kind of working with a client right now that is in those early stages of trying to figure out what they're going to do with the business and, what's the business worth. That seems to be the number one question is what's the value of the business? Is it worth as much as I think it is? In most cases, probably not. In some cases, maybe more. And they just really don't understand the whole process of how do you get to a valuation. And, we were talking a couple of weeks ago with this particular client because he's had somebody approach them for making an offer. They haven't given a lot of information. So he's now asking the question, well, what is this thing worth? And, maybe you can start by kind of talking through your end of the scenario of, okay, how do we get to that price point?
I think most of the time we'll try to simplify what valuation looks like on a company level. Essentially, you figure out what is the net income of the company, and then you apply an industry multiple. So depending on what your industry might fetch in the marketplace, you use a multiple of your net income. And the reason for that, I always said to people was, if you could look at the multiple, think of it like this is the number of years that your industry expects the buyer will take to get their money back. So if you take that net income, that's what you're expecting they're going to put in their pocket every year. And that times this multiple tells you the multiple of how many years it's going to take to actually get your money back. So if something has a really unique product or service that they're offering, that multiple could be high, right? But then if it's got that uniqueness to it, you should be able to make it into something that further reduces it. In other words, speeds it up and puts it back in your pocket.
Let's talk about that a little bit because I drive a lot, so listening to a lot of satellite radio, and I always seem to get bombarded with these ads of sell your company. We have experience selling your business, and we can sell it for 10x or more. I don't know of many companies out there that can get a 10 times value on their EBITDA. And maybe you just want to go over EBITDA again for those listeners who aren't familiar with that acronym or don't know what all the different letters mean.
Okay.
Put you on the spot, see if you remember.
EBITDA means earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So you start out with net income and you can add those things back. The interest, the taxes, the depreciation, and the amortization you can add back because most of those things are things that the buyer is not necessarily going to match. Okay, if they buy your assets, they're going to get a different basis. So the depreciation is going to be different. If they buy at a higher multiple, they probably buy some goodwill. Their amortization is going to be different than yours was. The interest has to do with financing. If they're not financing, they don't have any. So they want to get to the point of this is the before those items, and then use that as their starting point. Getting in the car and driving and getting this ad of "we'll get you 10x." I'd love to see you do it for me, but I'm not so sure that I would immediately jump and make the phone call. Although I'm sure there's plenty of people who would say, "Hey, if you're going to get me 10x, I'll have the phone call."
Well, I think that is what attracts a lot of that attention is, well, we can get you that 10 multiple. And I think of anything that I've talked with somebody about, as far as thinking of selling their business, typically it's more like 4 times, maybe 5 times, 6 if it's a really, really strong business in the right industry with the right market value and everything else on it. But getting a 10x is kind of a unicorn. I've only seen or really heard of it when it's been like you said unique technology. So somebody's coming in with this brand new technology, maybe they've got a patent on it, or maybe they're first in the market and they pretty much have the market right now. Mm-hmm. That's typically the only time I've seen it or heard about it is, those IT companies or those social media companies where they just get this obscene offering early on in the game by somebody who sees the opportunity and brings in investors for it. But the typical business, manufacturing, construction, automotive, kind of the areas I play in, 5 times is sometimes a stretch.
And I've seen where the market was laying for a while in that 4 to 5 range, and then when it started to be, the media started picking up on this, transfer of wealth and the transfer of businesses and people's ages translated to when their businesses would actually be, sort of eligible for sale because the owner wants to retire. They've jumped on that bandwagon, and basically by publishing a lot of that, they've pushed the envelope a little bit. Because everybody says, "Oh yeah, guess what? I'm at that age. I could sell," and everybody's looking for me to sell. So why don't I sell it at 6? So the asking prices have become more like 6. That doesn't mean that's where they closed, but the asking prices have they've pushed it up to 6. Lots of reasons why that doesn't necessarily work out in the long run, because I think we'll get into that. But it's a stretch, because the numbers don't necessarily align for what the buyer can do, and what the banks will approve. If you're debt financing, there's always a banker. There's always There's always another guy who's going to tell you whether or not you can actually do it. And if they can't do it, then, you're not going to close at 6. Um, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say if they're asking for 6, I don't know that I would make an offer at 6. Um, but if you don't make an offer that's close, they're going to keep waiting for somebody else and not you. So, yeah, but I think I've seen 11.
Mm-hmm.
The shoe company I was working for sold for, I believe, an 11 or 12. Very lean company, very smartly run, and the margins were fabulous on the product.
Mm-hmm.
If you are able to sell that product that cost you $20 to make with high quality, and you're able to sell it for 120, then the multiple sort of makes some kind of sense that you're making a whole lot of extra cash on a well-run company with low overhead. So all comes down to cash flow.
Well, let's talk a little bit more. We'll get back into the cash flow part of it, but you've said a couple times now, well-run company. I am sure there are plenty of business owners out there that say, well, my company is well run. I manage it with an iron fist. I track everything. I monitor everything. I control everything. And I believe that leads to maybe a misunderstanding of what well run means. In my world, I would say that's poorly run because, of course, the moment you sell your business, you are no longer the owner of your business. And most likely, if you're in retirement age, you don't want to be in the business anymore. Maybe on a consultant level, but either way, you're stepping back from day-to-day operations. And when I look at a well-run business, that business ownership is expanded to other members of the leadership team. In other words, the owner is now not the weakest link because they control everything. They're the strongest link because you can take them out of the equation and the business will run just fine without them being there. And when I talk with business owners that are considering selling their business, and you start asking questions about, who makes all the decisions here? Where does the decision making stop? Who does it have to go through? How do things get done? And when everything points back to that individual, so if I hear I a lot, that's the first warning sign that you're lowering the value of your company because you are the business. There is nobody else here. It's once you leave, all the control is gone, all the sale is gone, all the marketing, all the operations, all the HR, everything just walked out the door. Yes, you have some employees, equipment, maybe some property, but the bottom line is you directed everything. And when you're gone, you basically have a rudderless ship here now because everyone else isn't going to know what to do or how to perform. Mm-hmm. And as an investor side, when I look at that going, well, now I got to replace that person. I got to replace them with 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 other people. That makes it really hard to justify even what you're talking about with the 6 multiple. And maybe that's where you'll start getting into, okay, why does that number not work? Because, and you can kind of fill in the blanks there. But I mean, from your experience, what have you seen when you're talking about well-run company? For example, the shoe company, you mentioned that they were very well run. I'm assuming, again, had strong leadership, and that leadership was diversified over multiple people, not just one individual.
Yeah, I would say when they were selling, they were very well run. It probably took 3 or 4 years to get there because mm-hmm. at the beginning of me meeting them, I would have told you they were not very well run. It's one of the reasons I got the job was the fact that it was not very well run. The management had made a pretty serious mistake with their supply chain. And when they did that, they had to rebuild it and rebuild their entire plan. It was at the point of, okay, if we leaned a little too far left, we were shutting the doors and closing the business. And if we leaned a little further right, hopefully we would get on a better trajectory, which we wound up on the right. And we pushed it to the point where everything grew. But I think that the well-run part of it was the CEO was very much focused on new product, on marketing, on moving into online retail sales, and got away from the old wholesale model. Okay. And he was able to do that because he had Mike, myself, um, the gentleman in the back who ran the warehouse. He had a key team that essentially took over and ran everything while he was doing all the things that he needed to do to turn the company around. So it was a team aspect. It was not you know, when we all go and talk about our story, we all say I all the time.
Right.
We all take credit for the win, but it's a team. It was everybody working together to get that done. And that's really what I mean by well run, right? On top of that, we had data for everything that we were doing. We knew which products were selling. We had 5,000 SKUs and we knew which ones were the best. We had all of the operational background behind it, not just financial numbers, not just, look, we have all this dollars in our pocket, so we're fabulous. But, while we had that, we had all the reasons why there was money in our pocket. So I think that part of it is the piece that supports what you said, that it really is, did you take the time to actually put this together so when you sell it, you have the ability to say, here's all the data on everything that we've done in the last 4 years, and here's the reason why we're so successful, and here's the reason why we're going to continue to grow. And, from what I understand, after I left, because we sold the company, after I left, it continued to grow. So as the information goes, it was whoever the buyer was, which I know who it was, but I won't say it. They made a very, very smart decision to buy it.
Now, when you talk about the 6 multiple valuation, and you said something that I thought was unique, or because everyone talks about the valuation, trying to get the valuations up, but you said a lot of these companies maybe are getting offered that, but they might not actually achieve that. What are some of the clawbacks or some of the issues that pop up that prevent that valuation from hitting the high mark that maybe comes in on the letter of intent that after the due diligence now falls apart?
I generally think that it's just, anybody can put together a really pretty package, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get in behind it, you take a look and you hit the risks. Everybody has risks, and it's a matter of what's your level of risk that you're willing to tolerate to take the purchase. So it's sort of those things become your clawback. Again, we go back to exactly what you said. If the owner is the only one really doing anything, and now you've got all these people who look to the owner for the answer of how to do anything, and like you said, you're in a rudderless ship. Now you have to go spend other money to go replace that part. We'll call it that part of the owner, because we don't know which ones, right? Depending on your tolerance, you might say, well, the owner was in the back constantly, moving inventory around, which I've seen.
You and me both.
So he's moving inventory around. Well, now I need a different inventory manager, or I need to make sure that inventory manager that's there is actually trained to do what I want him to do. CEO is partly, he's the HR guy. So it's like you start figuring out how many other things do I have to go and hire someone else to do because this owner is going to leave. I believe those are some of the things that are going to, show up on the add back. And maybe we should explain that. Like, the add back is, if we were talking before about EBITDA, right? You add back those couple things that everybody's going to have a different number. So you get back to EBITDA as your starting point. And then you can adjust that EBITDA for things that are not normal. So in other words, I've seen one where, EBITDA would have included a fraudulent transfer of money, right? That just so happened to happen right before they were putting the business up for sale. Okay. Do you think that's going to happen again? No. So how does that affect your EBITDA? You lost $1.4 million and somebody came in and basically stole it from you. Okay. So you tightened up your ship and you basically said that's not going to happen again. So do you add it back? because you're saying it's not going to happen again. So the new owner is going to have a $1.4 million bigger potential, you know? And like we were talking about the owner, there's less of a potential because you're going to have to go and pay more to bring somebody else in to replace the fact that the CEO was doing that job. Or you're going to evaluate the employees underneath there and you're going to say, we have the wrong management team in here. We want to change some of these people around and they're going to cost us more money. So what's the difference? You're going to spend more money. So put that in your plan as to what your projected EBITDA is going to be. And then you do the multiple off of that. So again, those things get adjusted, but I think management team, employees, look, if you're going to come in and improve the business, I don't think your seller is going to tell you, well, I'll pay for that with a reduced price so you can go and build my business bigger than it was when I was here. I don't think anyone's going to do that. But if you're talking about the fact that I just want to buy a business that tomorrow is going to work normally, then those are types of things that you should be able to negotiate in your valuation price. You're gonna basically say this is why it's different.
Now you were talking about debt finance, which would, as you mentioned, be through a bank. But we're still hearing a lot about private equity, those different markets, which I would say are, we could argue that they're pretty much the same because whether it's an investor or whether it's a bank, they're all have some interest in gaining on whatever the purchase is and the growth of that purchase in some sort of interest payout or equity payout. How do you look at that and try to decide what makes a good deal for you? So let's look at it from the seller's point of view. If they're trying to figure out, a private equity firm, for example, you see this a lot in construction right now. They're knocking on plumbers, electricians, you name it, and they want to gobble these things up because they know there's a demand well into the future for this type of service. So when does private equity make sense versus when you might go to a private seller that then is going to use bank financing to essentially purchase the business?
I think the thing that I would stress is that even if you're going to private equity, the likelihood is they're using bank financing anyway, at least for a portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to come into play somewhere. Private equity tends to be a little bit more complicated deal, at least as far as I can tell. The things that I've seen are tranches, which I think the French word, I think it's a French word that means pieces. So you get it in pieces. So you start out with a piece and then you get an extension if certain things are hit, and then you get, the pie in the sky money. So you kind of wind up still doing some degree of work. Or you also tend to get the point where you're still owning a part of the business or you're still financing a part of the business. So seller notes are common, seller retained equity is common, and it becomes a little more complicated and you have to think it really through of, can I actually do the extended work that I have to do in order to get that second tranche? And then can I really get the pie in the sky money?
Yeah.
Or am I just basically saying, look, if I get the first money, I'm okay. And if I get the second money, that's even great. But maybe I don't think that I'm ever going to get the third money. You have to be willing to think that way.
Right.
Because if you don't, you're going to be selling based on, I'm going to get that money. And then what happens when you don't? On a private seller, you have a little bit different risk, right? You're risking the fact that, are you selling to someone who knows your industry? Are you selling to someone who is going to be able to build on it? Are you able to still get some degree of a second tranche? Because from what I've seen, the smaller the deal, the more likely they're going to use financing from an SBA lender, as long as they qualify for that. And the SBA has very specific rules about how it goes. But if I'm going to use SBA financing and buy your business, the first thing I'm going to want to do is have you retain at least a piece of it. and you're going to have to wait for that money for whatever reason, whether it's going to be you hit a certain point or whether you can do it for 2 years, something to that effect where you're still going to be tied to it. And part of that reason is you have to make sure that the business is going to continue the way that it did before. So you're still sticking around to ensure that the business is going to continue on the path that it was on, and then you'll get your money after that. Um, but you're being held to it at least a little bit. So there's not a lot from a finance standpoint that's a lot different, except that I would say private equity money generally has a little bit more flexibility to keep it to keep the deal sound. In other words, they have relationships with banks. They generally don't come in and say, "Well, I need bank financing, but I got to go find one." Well,
Right.
they probably have one already. It's probably already set up. They have investors who are coming in and putting in a certain number of dollars, and they can set up the deal so that um, it falls into the right parameters for liquidity. In other words, your business can't be run with no money. So they're going to make sure that it's structured properly. Now, a new buyer who's never bought a business before, who suddenly comes in and has to go find a financer and hasn't thought through the cash flow, seen all that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have the same resources, and that's intellectual resources. It's the ability to say, hey, we did that other deal last week. What was it that we made a mess of? Something we messed up? Can we not do that on this deal? How do we avoid that? So they have intellectual resources that come in and say, here's how we're going to do it. I don't believe an individual buyer has that.
Right.
Okay, I'll be careful because I don't want to make everybody mad. Okay, but
I'm sure there are some out there, but
it's less
let's
likely.
say the first deal, the search
Yeah.
funder type people
Yeah.
tend to be younger, shopping for that first deal, and maybe don't have the background or the experience to pull it off.
Yeah. So I would tell you as a seller, the biggest thing I would tell you to do is vet your buyer very carefully. They're probably very nice people, and I have no doubt of that. Make sure they're going to cover you. Don't look at them and say, "Oh yeah, he's a smart kid. I can take care of that. I can make sure he's going to take care of me because if he doesn't know how to take care of you, he's not going to take care of you." So, and private equity, it's a different thing. Vet them as well. Do they know what they're doing? Especially if you're on the hook for that second tranche or third tranche, make sure that it's likely you're going to get it.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing to make in mind, especially with private equity, because to me, that a lot of people look at that as very attractive because it's typically the private equity numbers that come in these multiples that are just obscene even for their industry standards.
Mm-hmm.
They're offering, if it's normally a 4 to 5 time multiple, they're coming in saying, well, we're going to get you 10 to 15 time, but there's always an asterisk by it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to get a certain amount of money up front, and maybe that money is pretty good. So to your point, is that, the first part, the part good enough, and then the other two parts are extra and you're fine if you don't get it. But as you point out, a lot of people kind of look at that end number and go, well, I'm expecting X millions of dollars because they promised me that. Well, they didn't really promise you that. And also you had to hit these certain milestones to get that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's often the part that's missed when you talk to private equity, where if you go to a private sale, and as you pointed out, you have to do your vetting there as well to make sure that they have the ability to get the cash, that they can close on the deal.
Yep.
And ultimately, especially if you're looking to step away from the business, you don't want to do this anymore. Equity back in ownership. Oh, we blanked out there for a second. Hopefully we didn't lose
weird.
everything.
That was very weird.
Hopefully you caught everything I was saying there. But it's basically you really have to kind of weigh your options because the private equity route is going to keep you actively involved in that business in most cases, where a private sale is different because most cases they want to take over the business and they might not want you to be part of it. So it gives you an early exit if you want to get out. Maybe you're going to do some consulting for a year or two, but pretty much you're done. Where maybe more on the private equity side, they're going to say, well, you're locked into this for 5+ years and you're going to be running your own company at our guidance, and you're going to have to do that. So if you're in your 50s or 60s, you got to decide if that's really something you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on what kind of company you're running. I think who you sell it to really comes down to the structure of the deal, whether you can get more out of it by going one way or the other. So every deal still remains unique, even though you could probably take the financial side of it from the private equity and from the individual, if some individual is making you an offer, and I think you compare the two and you'll find that the deal itself is relatively close. It's the alternatives, the other pieces
Right.
that you have to think about. So I think, don't forget, and the reason everybody's going to say, no, you can't do that. How can you compare private equity to an individual? If an individual has the opportunity to buy your business as a starting point and then go buy another one, they're private equity.
Right.
They're doing the same thing. It's just at their earlier stage. So, I think that when you think of it that way, that's when you start to look at what's the other alternatives. What are the other pieces of this that I'm not thinking about?
Yeah.
Because then you can say the deals are relatively the same.
Well, I would even say on the valuation side. So, let's just use this as an example. Private sale might get you, maybe they value your business at $5 million. Maybe a private equity comes in and says, we're going to value your business at $15 million. Okay, you're looking at going, well, $15 million is 3 times what the other guy's offering me. But here's the thing. You'll get maybe that $5 million up front. So that's cash free and clear. You have to then earn out another $5 million over the next couple of years, and then you get the final $5 million after we sell the private equity to somebody else that, they always throw out the 10x number. Once we get our 10 multiple after selling this conglomerate we built, that's where you get the last piece. So that's where the 15 million comes in. Mm-hmm. But the last two parts are not guaranteed. There's no assurance that you're going to get either that 5 million that you got to earn yourself back into, or the 5 million when the private equity company sells, where you get that present value of money, and you don't have to worry about the further commitments if you go to the private sale route. Right. So on top of what you're saying, I think you also have to look at the deal from a holistic point of view and say, what am I really getting out of this? And do I want to take my own risk to get more potentially, or am I happy with taking this chunk now, knowing this is perfectly well what the business is worth, and I am not committed to this long-term deal that could or could not possibly happen?
Yeah. Yeah, structure's definitely something to think about. Something to think more about, which you probably haven't. And I agree with you that 15 versus 5 million, that makes a lot of sense, because I have seen that, and they don't necessarily care about the fact that they offered you the extra 10 million. It's the fact that you have to go make 20 million before you get that 10 million. So they still got
Exactly.
10 million on top of your 10 million, So again, without getting any further flustered about it, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right?
Exactly.
I'm trying to word it, and I don't know that I really can, but the theory's there, right?
They're it's not necessarily a bad deal. Whichever one you go with isn't necessarily a bad deal, no. But that's, again, where you have to understand where you're at in this whole equation. If you're 65 to 70, My guess is selling to private equity, knowing that you've got to put another 5+ years in to get your full take back from whatever they promised you, and you have to meet certain metrics that's going to maybe require you to work harder actually than you worked when you were owning the business yourself. That's something you got to consider. Yep. Now, it doesn't necessarily, again, mean that it's a bad deal. It's just, does that make sense for where you're at in the equation? If you're, again, in your 60s and 70s and say, look, I've done this for 30, 40 years, I am done, I just want to sell this thing and go retire, lay on a beach, do whatever, then you got to ask yourself, is that a different level of commitment? And am I willing to take the now money versus the potential money of the future? And I think that's where, talking with people that maybe have gone through this or that have dealt with some company sales and whatnot, I think is really valuable. Rich, you've gone through this a number of times. If somebody wants to get a hold of you and start asking questions, what's the best way to do it?
Send me an email, rich@xcxo.net.
And you can also send me an email at dan@xcxo.net, and we both love to help you. In fact, we do that 20 questions assessment, which I think is a good starting point to help you figure out what is your company worth. It's not a full-on detailed valuation. However, it points out clear bottlenecks and issues that you might have to address before you get to that point of sale. And this is ideal for, again, if you're, I would say within that 5-year window of looking at selling, this can be a perfect starting point to help get you to figure out what you need to start addressing, letting go of, putting in place to make sure you get the maximum amount of that business. Would you agree?
I totally agree.
Excellent. Well, that's good enough for this week. We've done an extra long version, so we'll catch up more next week. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Rich. Talk to you later.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to Books and the Biz. If today's conversation sparked new ideas for your company, the team at XCXO can help you turn those ideas into action. XCXO brings together seasoned executives, fractional CEOs, COOs, CFOs, and CXOs who step into your business with the experience, strategy, and leadership to drive real results. Whether you're trying to scale, strengthen operations, improve profitability, or prepare for transition, our experts help you move faster and lead with confidence. To learn more or start a conversation, visit xcxo.net. That's xcxo.net, your shortcut to stronger leadership and a better run business. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time on Books and the Biz.